Travisano says, I think it would be cool for Joe to talk about how DSP and room correction works. I feel like I do that. Don't I do that?
Maybe on like a lower level, maybe a 5th grade level.
I don't even know how.
Or like a beginner or intro, or I don't know.
Do you have a video on that? Like,
I have an old video of how to use REW, but sometimes I'm like, there's some stuff I would say differently now.
well, so I think maybe the simple way to go about it would be to say that room correction often isn't just room correction. It's correcting for everything. Like room correction would be correcting for response below like 300, 400, 500, 600 hertz, somewhere in that region, right? But a lot of these are correcting the overall response of the speaker and the room. So there's a delineation between speaker correction and room correction. And I don't think like Odyssey doesn't make that delineate. Now, Dirac does, right? With their 500 hertz and below package, that's more room. It's not called room correction, I don't think, but it's more akin to proper room correction than it is speaker correction. And a lot of times, if you have a good speaker, you don't want it to touch too much. You know, you're just trying to correct for the bass issues in the room, more ideally. If you have a bad speaker, if it has good directivity, like what Joe uses with Magic Beans, then theoretically, again, because I haven't used it, then you're fixing the speaker's linearity issues, but in a way that makes sense because it has good directivity, which means the reflections match the on-axis sound to some good degree, no pun intended. But if it's a crappy speaker with bad directivity, then you can't separate the reflections from the direct sound, and you're fighting them when you're trying to correct for one or the other. Yeah, I don't know how much sense that makes, but
with Magic Beans, we correct the in-situ near-field response of the speaker, and we target a neutral like flattish response, right? With respect to what's EQable, so we do take a look at directivity to make sure that we're not trying to boost something that's like foolish to try to fix. But I think there's a reason why we do that, not just basing it on anechoic only measurements, because sometimes there's variation from speaker to speaker. Sometimes like what we were talking about, where maybe the amplifier itself is load dependent, so that's affecting the frequency response, and that wouldn't show up in some anechoic measurements. It could be that they have some stuff that's nearby that's causing some reflections that maybe the TV's acting as a waveguide, right? And that's affecting things. Maybe their wall is too close, and so that's affecting the sound. Maybe they have an acoustic transparent screen in front of the speaker, and that needs to be accounted for as well, and that's not in the anechoic data. So that's why we're doing near field measurements, and we determine where the transition region is, and then we EQ below that differently. We're not trying to make that flat. We're trying to see what is the trend for what is the room wanting to do to the bass response based on like what are all the other speakers doing at your listening position, and we're just making that smoother. So we're not targeting an ideal, some bass rise that somebody else figured out. We're looking at what is the natural bass rise in your room, and let's follow that trend, but make it smooth, right? To a certain degree. We're not trying to boost dips that are impossible to boost anyway, but to a reasonable amount, and we're trying to make that smooth. Now, one thing I just recently learned that's interesting is we export something called like a speaker response, where it does show the in-room directivity. We call it in-room directivity. And what I think is fascinating is if you compare that to a Klippel measurement, where you can take a look at an ideal situation, like what's the ideal curve, what's the shape of this thing, and you compare it to the real world measurement. What I find interesting is that you can start to say, hey, you know what? I think this is your room, and these are ways that you can treat it. You're getting a bass suck out here. Maybe you want to address that, right? Because even though your ears might get used to it, it's still better to kind of make it more ideal if you can.
Yeah.
Right. So that's just a way of using it where you can compare your in-room measurements to the anechoic ones and start to figure out how you can start to adjust your room now. It informs you how to adjust your room. So that's some next level stuff. But yeah, there you go.
Now, if you can't catch the show, we do have an audio version at anchor.fm/daily HiFi. So make sure to go on over there if you like to listen to the show.